Just after finishing my Halia Dawnblade conversion, I wanted to set myself a new challenge of converting these Attilan Rough Riders to a unit of Freeguild Cavaliers. Let's see how I get on. I really like doing this Halia conversion, so I wanted to keep the idea going and Kitbash together her own personal guard unit. The perfect box for this is the Attilan Rough Riders that I've had since the day they got released, and it's about time I put them to good use. I started off by building the bulk of the Rough Riders model. Most of the parts on the model can easily be used in AOS, so the only parts that were really missing were the heads, and for now I left off the right arms because I didn't want to use their weapons, except for the sword because it looked really nice. After I finally got my Freeguild and Cities of Sigmar bits sorted out, I picked some parts that will suit the Cavaliers and the AOS aesthetic. I have some leftover shields from the new City of Sigmar set that can be easily added onto the arms. But before I start adding on bits, there's some cleanup needed. I started by removing the Adeptus Militarum skull and wings from the chest on the horse. At the rear, there's an imprint on the horse's side. For all these years, I finally get to crack open a pot of liquid green stuff and fill in the imprint as best I can. One of these guys has a grenade strapped on his back, so I remove it and tidy it up as best I can. I also had to remove parts from the horse's feet, like sandbags and other parts like that didn't really fit. All these models have rifles on the horses, and even though the Cavaliers don't have any ranged weapons, they're just too cool not to have them on, so I left them on. But they do have pistol holsters on their hip that definitely doesn't fit the look. I carefully remove them, and I thought they were a separate piece that I glued on somehow, and I was hoping they might just pop off. For the champion with the sword, I wanted to go with the big fancy helmet, but I couldn't get it to fit properly and it kind of looked out of place, so I left it off. I found this rope and clop bit that fits perfectly at the back of the horse, and I also found this cape bit that would have looked really good, but it was just too small and it was a little bit chunky and it didn't look right. But I did find a vulture bird that I think is from the ogres, and it fits perfectly on the shoulder, and you're going to see that later on. For Cavalier number 2, I kept it simple by changing the original pole weapon a little bit by replacing the top of it with the old Freeguild spear part. For the third Cavalier, I got a little trickier because I wanted to add weapons from the Freeguild Cavaliers bits, but I had to keep the original Rough Rider arms to keep the aesthetic right. The problem is that the only arm I had left for this guy had the original pole moulded to his arm, but with some careful knife cuts, I was able to replace the pole with a warhammer. I also added this cool looking bit I found on the rider's hip. For Cavalier number 4, I wanted to add a little bit extra. Since these are Halia's personal unit, I wanted to add some of the Skaven Slayer elements to him, and I thought what better than a rat catching device. I found this perfect claw type bit in my 40k bits, and I added it to the top of the pole. I leave the wires on so I can have this like mechanical look. The final Cavalier of course has to be the standard bearer. This is a simple swap from the Cavaliers banner. I cut off the pole just above both pieces and swapped them over. With the models put together and the liquid green stuff dry, it's time to get painting. When it came to painting the horses, I didn't want to give them all the same colour, so I did a mixed colour for the unit. I did want to try a pinto coat, which is half white and half another colour, but there's just not enough of the horse's coat visible to really show it off. After priming the models grey, I started by painting XV88 on 2 of the horses and Rhinox Hide on 3 of them. On the tan horses, I layered on Baller Brown and followed up with a shade of Seraphim Sepia. Once dry, I brightened the back up with Baller Brown again, but leaving the shaded recesses alone. For the tail, I used Xandri Dust, a dry brush of Screaming Skull, a shade of Agrax Earthshade, and then finished it off with a final dry brush of Screaming Skull. For the dark brown, I started with Rhinox Hide. Then I went with the paint that I haven't used before, which is Doom Bull Brown. When dry, I shaded the skin with Agrax Earthshade, followed by a final layering of Doom Bull Brown. For the tail, I started with Abaddon Black, a dry brush of Dawnstone, a shade of Null and Oil, and finished it off with a final dry brush of Dawnstone. For the rest of the model, I wanted to get all the base cuts down first. So starting with the horse's robes and with the colours of Fair Farrig being blue and white, it was an easy choice to paint down Calgar blue. Being a light colour, it took 2 to 3 layers to get a solid coat down. Next was the rider's clothes, and I went with Dark Reaper. But looking back, I think I should have went with something a little bit brighter because it's the same colour as the Attilan rider's box art. I painted Scrag Brown on all the leather straps on both horses and the rider. Time to get some of the Fair Farrig white on now, and I thought that the horse's head cover was the right place for it. I painted multiple thin layers of red one on the head while being extra careful not to get any on the horse's ears. For the red parts, I used Corn Red to get a solid base coat on. Instead of the usual silver colours, I went with Runelord brass on most of the metal parts. This included the armour panels on the front, the leg armour and the head armour. For the rider's boots and gloves, Abaddon black was used. On the rider's sleeping bags, or blankets maybe, I went with XV88 again. And I went back to Calgar blue for the shields, and again at least 2 thin layers were needed for a solid coat. One of the parts I nearly missed was the gun stock, so I made sure to go back to it and paint it with dryad bark. To finish off the metal parts like the weapons, shields and a few smaller parts, I went a good old reliable lead belcher. For the final parts, I painted the rider's face with Kislev flesh and his hair with storm vermin fur. After a lengthy cleanup, it was time to start shading, and I began by adding Drakenhof nightshade into the blue parts. Then it was the rider's clothes, and to bring that colour together, I went all over it with Nuln Oil. For the leather and brown parts, I found this soft brown shade mixture from Artist Opus YouTube channel, and I wanted to give it a try even though there's not a lot of surface area for the brown. It was a mixture of 1 part Nuln Oil, 1 part lemon medium and 3 parts seraphim sepia. Definitely a mixture I want to try in the future. I also shade the rider's hair with this mix. Next was the white, and over the years I found that the contrast paint Apothecary white is a great shade to go over white colours. It gives it a little bit of a bluish grey tone. For the skulls, ropes and bag, I went to seraphim sepia to soften the rape bone base colour. After painting the vulture's feathers with Abaddon black and his skin with rape bone, I shaded his skin down with a mix of seraphim sepia and Gryph-hound orange. To finally finish off the shading, I used Reichland Fresh Shade on the rider's face. On to the last hurdle with the highlights. Starting with the leather, and I went back to Scrag Brown and carefully edge highlighted all the edges of the straps and the pouches. The blue needed a bit more of a cleanup because I have overdone it a little bit with the Drakenhof Nightshade. I tinned down Calgar blue and just glazed up the higher parts of the horse's robes to brighten it back up. Then I highlighted the edges, the higher parts of the robes and the shield's edges with rust grey. For the white, I added pallid witch flesh along the edges and the higher parts of the horse's head, and then edge highlighted the cloth on the back. For the rider's clothes, I went back to rust grey to try and brighten it up a little bit because they were a little dark for me and rust grey was a nice tone for that. The gloves and the boots were then edge highlighted with Administratum grey, but the vulture's feathers were dry brushed. To highlight the silver and the bronze parts, I tried out this pot of Necron compound I had lying around for a while, and I don't think it's meant to look like this, but I managed to work with it by rubbing it onto my palette and dry brushing it on. For the final highlight, I added some Kislev flesh highlights onto the rider's face. To finish the model off, I added some sterling mud and sand to the base and painted a base colour of Scrag Brown. When dry, I shaded it with Skeleton Horde, followed by a dry brush of Scrag Brown. After adding some grass tufts on, I finished it off with a dry brush of Dawnstone. After spending way too long on this project, I'm finally able to say that it's finished. It's a really nice looking unit that fits with Halia and the team of the Fair Farrig army. The name I've given them is the Locker Guard, which is Irish for the Hero Guard and fits perfectly into my Cities of Sigmar army. Speaking of that army, I have a lot of units that I still need to get through, but they're on the top of my to-do list, so I'm looking forward to getting them all ready. But if you like this video, let me know in the comment section below, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't, and once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next video.